before kings, before empires. Before a single word was written into law, humanity stumbled upon something new, something intoxicating, and something incredibly dangerous: power. Imagine the scene: a small, tight-knit group of early humans, surviving day to day. Life was a collective effort. Everyone had a role, a purpose, driven by the simple need to see the sunrise again. In this world, leadership wasn't a prize, it was a burden. Someone had to make the tough calls. Where do we hunt? Where do we find shelter from the storm? Who keeps watch at night? The person who stepped up wasn't a ruler. Their authority was temporary, earned through wisdom, strength, or courage. Power, in its purest form, was a tool for survival. It was a shield held up to protect the entire group. But a shield can also be used as a weapon. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift. The responsibility of leadership started to feel good. The respect given out of necessity began to be expected as a right. The person who made decisions for the group's survival started making decisions for their own benefit. The first taste of power was addictive, and it began to curdle in the hands of those who held it. What started as a practical arrangement turned into something else entirely. It became control. The leader's voice grew louder, while others were expected to be quiet. The informal respect of the group hardened into a formal hierarchy. Suddenly, there was a top and a bottom. There were those who gave orders and those who followed them. The very concept of us began to splinter into them and me. This wasn't a sudden coup. It was a slow, creeping transformation. The leader, who once protected the group, now needed to protect their position. They surrounded themselves with loyal followers, rewarding them with extra food or better shelter. Those who questioned their authority were no longer seen as collaborators, but as threats. They were isolated, shamed, or even cast out. Fear, an emotion once reserved for predators and the unknown, was now turned inward, used to maintain order and silence dissent. Power stopped serving the people and started shaping them. It decided who had a voice, who was valuable, and whose life mattered less. It created the first lines of inequality, not based on skill or contribution, but on proximity to the one in charge. The communal spirit that had defined humanity for millennia began to erode, replaced by suspicion and the question was no longer what is best for us, but what is best for me, and how do I keep it? Once tasted, this new kind of power demanded more. It was a hunger that could never be satisfied. It needed more authority, more obedience, more silence from the crowd. The leader's desires became the group's laws. Their paranoia became the group's reality. History, which had once been a shared story of survival, was now being returned or erased by a single hand. Those who obeyed were remembered. Those who resisted were forgotten. This pivotal moment in our distant past is not just ancient history, it's the blueprint for so much of our world today. The struggle between power as a service and power as a form of domination is a story that has been replayed in every village, every city, and every empire since. It's the ghost in our political systems, the tension in our workplaces, and the dynamic in our relationships. To understand why our world is the way it is, why we have hierarchy, inequality, and the constant struggle for control, we have to look back to this beginning. We must return to that critical moment when power was first claimed, first tasted, and never truly given back. It's a force that was meant to protect us, but in the end, it became the very thing that divided us, and we have been living with the consequences ever since. The first topic is before power had a name. Have you ever stopped to think about where power actually comes from? Not the kind you see in politics or boardrooms today, but the very first spark of it. Before power had a name, before it was a system, it was simply a necessity. Let's travel back in time, way back, to when our ancestors lived in a world of constant uncertainty. Food was scarce, danger was everywhere, and the only way to survive was to stick together. In these small, tight-knit groups, decisions had to be made fast. Someone had to take charge, but this wasn't about being the boss. It was about responsibility. Imagine a hunt. Who leads? Who leads? Not the person with the loudest voice, but the strongest, most skilled hunter. Who decides when the group should move to a new area? The elder who remembers the seasons and knows the land. This early form of leadership was fluid, temporary, and practical. Power wasn't a crown you wore. It was a tool you picked up when the group needed it. It shifted from person to person depending on the situation. The best person for the job got the job, and when the job was done, the power dissolved back into the group. No one owned it. No one inherited it. Its only purpose was to keep everyone alive. In these early communities, equality wasn't some lofty ideal they debated around a campfire. It was their reality. Everyone's survival was intertwined. If one person failed, the whole group was at risk. Hoarding resources or trying to control others wasn't just selfish. It was a direct threat to the community's existence. That's why this early leadership had built-in limits. A leader who made bad decisions, who put the group in danger, wouldn't be leader for long. They could be ignored, challenged, or simply replaced. Power had boundaries, set not by laws, but by common sense and the urgent need to survive. It was a beautiful, functional system born out of necessity. But this wasn't going to last forever. A massive change was on the horizon, one that would transform human society and the very nature of power itself. This big shift happened when humans stopped wandering and started settling down. The invention of agriculture was a game. For the first time, we weren't just surviving day to day, we were producing a surplus. Extra food, more than we needed to eat right away. And with surplus came a brand new concept: ownership. This is my grain. This is your plot of land. Suddenly, some people had more than others. More food, more land, and with it, more influence. This inequality planted a seed for a new kind of power, one that could be held onto, accumulated, and kept. As communities stayed in one place, memory became a powerful force. The past started to shape the future. The hunter who successfully led last season's big hunt. It made sense to ask him to lead again. The elder whose wisdom saved the group from a harsh winter. Her voice carried more weight in the next council. Slowly but surely, experience began to harden into authority. And authority, over time, turned into expectation. People started to look to the same individuals for guidance, not just in a crisis, but all the time. This was a critical turning point. The question was no longer, who is the best person for this specific moment? It was becoming, who is the person who should always be in charge? Power was detaching itself from the immediate needs of survival. It was becoming permanent, and permanence changed everything. With permanent leaders came hierarchy. A pyramid started to form. Some voices became louder, more important. Other voices grew quieter, pushed to the margins. Decisions that were once made by the group, through consensus and debate, now flowed from the top down. At first, this probably felt like a good thing. It was efficient. It brought a sense of order and stability to a life that had always been chaotic. But in gaining that order, something vital was lost. The natural balance was disturbed. Think about it. When power had no name, when it was just a temporary role, you couldn't really defend it. It just was. It appeared when needed and vanished when it wasn't. But once power became a fixed position, a permanent role held by a specific person or family, it needed to be justified. Why should they rule and not someone else? Tu answertis. We started telling stories. Myths were created about divine rights, heroic ancestors, and sacred bloodlines to explain why certain people deserved to be in charge. Traditions and rituals were established to protect and reinforce their authority. What began as a practical tool for survival was slowly morphing into an ideology. This was the true birth of power as a concept. It was no longer just something you did leading a hunt, finding water. It became something you had, something you could own, protect, and pass down. And this is the crucial lesson from our deep past. Once power could be owned, it could be abused. Once it was disconnected from the well-being of the entire group and connected to the interests of a few. The door opened for selfishness, for corruption, and for control. The simple, fluid responsibility of our ancestors had been forged into the complex, and often dangerous, systems of authority we know today. So as we look at the world around us, at the structures of power that define our lives, it's worth remembering where it all began. It started not with a desire to dominate, but with a need to cooperate. It started with a shared responsibility for survival. Understanding this origin story doesn't just tell us about the past. It gives us a new lens to examine the present. It forces us to ask critical questions. Does the power we see today serve the group, or does it serve itself? Is it a responsibility, or is it a possession? By looking back at the moment before power had a name, we can better understand the world we've built, and maybe, just maybe, find clues on how to build a better one. The second topic is when leadership became control. Have you ever wondered when leadership stopped being about guidance and started feeling like control? It wasn't a sudden, dramatic event. It was a quiet, gradual shift, happening through small changes that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time. It began when leaders, once a source of guidance in a crisis, started making all the decisions, even when there was no emergency. Slowly, friendly advice hardened into firm instruction. Then, instruction tightened into unyielding command. Power stopped responding to the needs of the group and began creating its own needs. Those in positions of authority started to define what was considered normal. Their personal choices became the unspoken rules. Their preferences evolved into unquestioned traditions. And suddenly, questioning these norms felt risky. Not because the rules were inherently right or fair, but because they were backed by the full weight of authority. This is the subtle genius of control. It thrives when it appears justified. Early power structures figured this out very quickly. They learned to frame control as protection. They described blind obedience as loyalty, and any form of resistance, no matter how valid, was labeled a threat to the group's stability. In this way, power didn't just shape actions. It reshaped language itself, twisting words to serve its own purpose. But the real turning point, the moment leadership truly became control, was the introduction of punishment. Think about it. Genuine leadership aims to correct mistakes and help people grow. Control, on the other hand, seeks to punish disobedience. Once power began enforcing its will through fear, it crossed a fundamental line. A simple disagreement was no longer part of a healthy discussion. It was an act of defiance. Authority couldn't tolerate doubt, because doubt is the kryptonite to control. So, power learned to silence it, swiftly and effectively. This is where social inequality began to deepen its roots. Not everyone experienced this new form of power in the same way. Some people were close to the center of authority, benefiting from its structure. For others, particularly those far from the decision-making process, power felt less like guidance and more like a restrictive force. A cage. The further you were from the top, the more power felt like brute force. But control needed to outlive any single leader. To achieve this permanence, power embedded itself deep within systems. It wove itself into customs, rituals, and the very first laws. This masterstroke made control seem ancient, as if it were a natural part of the world rather than a human construction. People began to obey not because they were convinced by the logic, but simply because it has always been this way. That single belief was power's greatest victory, the key to itself. As control grew stronger, its primary objective shifted. It stopped serving the needs of the group and started serving itself. Protecting the authority of the system became more important than protecting the people within it. Maintaining stability, at any cost, mattered more than ensuring fairness. Preserving order was prioritized over seeking truth. Originally, leadership emerged to help humanity navigate a dangerous world and survive. But control emerged for a different reason: to help power survive humanity. This was the critical moment when power lost its neutrality. From this point forward, power would actively resist, change, punish, refusal, and bend the arc of history around its own interests. And anyone who dared to question it, to think differently, would no longer be seen as a philosopher or a critical thinker, but as an enemy of the state. So what does this mean for us today? This historical shift isn't just a story from the past. It's a pattern that repeats. We see it in governments, in corporations, even in our own social circles. The line between leadership and control can be incredibly fine. A true leader empowers you. They inspire critical thinking, and they are accountable to the group they lead. A controller, on the other hand, demands obedience, discourages questions, and is accountable only to their own power. Recognizing this difference is the first step toward reclaiming our own agency. When you see guidance turning into command, or loyalty being used to demand silence, it's worth asking, is this leadership, or is this control? Is this system designed to serve the people, or is it designed to serve itself? By asking these questions, we don't become enemies. We become the thinkers and innovators that true leadership has always needed. We become the force that nudges power back toward its original purpose: to serve, to protect, and to guide, not to dominate. If this idea resonated with you, consider subscribing and joining the conversation in the comments below. What are some modern examples you see of this shift from leadership to control? I'd love to hear your thoughts. The third topic is obedience, power's greatest weapon. Have you ever wondered why empires and powerful systems don't just collapse under their own weight? It's not just about brute force, armies, or police. In fact, relying on force is expensive, messy, and makes the power structure highly visible, which is actually a weakness. The true secret, the greatest weapon in power's arsenal, is something much quieter, much more subtle: obedience. It's the silent, repeated, unquestioned compliance of the many. Once obedience becomes the default setting for a society, power doesn't have to fight anymore. It just is. Think about it. Early systems of control, from ancient kingdoms to religious institutions, understood this principle deeply. They quickly realized that it's far more efficient to shape a mind than to restrain a body. So they began to frame obedience not as submission, but as a virtue. It was presented as duty, as loyalty, as the very essence of morality. To obey was to be a good person, a good citizen, a good believer. And conversely, to question, to doubt, to challenge that was framed as dangerous, selfish, and destructive. This was a brilliant move. Power successfully transformed compliance from a simple behavior into a core part of people's identity. Individuals began to define themselves by how well they followed the rules, how seamlessly they fit into the established order. This created a powerful psychological incentive. Obedience brought rewards, a sense of safety, social acceptance, and the feeling of belonging to a community. Disobedience, on the other hand, led to the most primal human fear: exclusion, being cast out, isolated, and alone. Over time, something fascinating happened. The fear of direct punishment, the whip, the prison, the executioner became less of a motivator than the fear of social exclusion. Power no longer needed to station a guard on every corner because society started to police itself. The community became the enforcer. Your neighbors, your family, your peers, they were the ones who would judge you, shame you, and pressure you back into line if you strayed too far. Rituals, customs, and traditions were the tools used to solidify this self-policing system. Think about the daily, weekly, and yearly routines that structure our lives. Repeated actions turn rules into habits. You do something over and over again, and you stop thinking about why you're doing it. Those habits, repeated across the whole population, eventually harden into collective beliefs. At that point, obedience doesn't feel like a command you're following. It feels natural, like the only sensible way to behave. It becomes common sense. This is so effective that people will often defend the very systems and rules that limit their own freedom, because questioning them would mean questioning their own identity and the world as they know it. Power also mastered the art of division. It's a classic strategy: divide and conquer. It learned to reward those who were most obedient with small privileges, a slightly better status, or a little more comfort. These weren't life-changing rewards, just enough to create a sense of loyalty and a feeling of being on the inside. This created a buffer class of people who benefited just enough from the system to have a vested interest in protecting it, even if that same system was harming others around them. In this clever way, power distributed the responsibility for control throughout the entire population, making everyone a tiny, unwitting part of the machine. The ultimate goal, the masterpiece of control, is what we can call voluntary obedience. This is when people choose to obey, believing it's their own idea or the best course of action. When this happens, power becomes practically invisible. There are no chains to see, no guards to blame. Authority hides behind benign-sounding words like order, stability, and tradition. Questioning the system starts to feel not just unnecessary, but fundamentally wrong, like you're trying to cause trouble for no reason. But here's the crucial part: the vulnerability in this entire structure. Obedience, no matter how deeply ingrained, relies on one fragile thing: belief. The entire system, the entire pyramid of power, rests on the assumption that the rules are necessary, that the authority is legitimate, and that this is just the way things are. The moment people begin to realize that obedience is a choice, not an immutable law of nature like gravity, the foundations of power begin to tremble. This is why a truly powerful system fears questions more than it fears an open rebellion. A rebellion is loud, visible, and can be crushed with force. But a question is silent. It spreads quietly from one mind to another. It doesn't announce itself with banners and slogans. It simply invites a person to think. And thinking is the antidote to blind obedience. When you start asking why, you are reclaiming your own mind. Why is this rule in place? Who does it truly benefit? Is there a better way? These simple questions are acts of liberation. They break the spell of habit and force us to look at the world with fresh eyes. Every empire, every hierarchy, every system of domination throughout human history has been built on the foundation of obedience. From the pharaohs of Egypt to the corporate structures of today, the principle remains the same. Control the behavior, and you control the people. That's why obedience has always been so carefully protected, praised as a virtue, and enforced with whatever means necessary. Because when you strip away all the symbols, the armies, and the laws, you find a simple truth. Obedience isn't just the behavior. It is, and has always been, power's greatest weapon. But the good news is, the power to question it lies within each of us. The fourth topic is how power learned to protect itself. How did power, this invisible force that shapes our lives, learn to make itself permanent? It's a fascinating question. Early on, power figured out a crucial secret. It doesn't come from the ruler, it comes from the obedience of the ruled. And once it understood that, it started building a fortress around itself. Not just with swords and guards, but with something far more enduring. Think about it. Power didn't want to be a temporary guest, dependent on the whims of a single king or queen. It wanted to become part of the furniture of life itself. So, it moved in. It embedded itself into our most fundamental structures. The family, our customs, the laws we write, and the beliefs we hold dear. Suddenly, power wasn't just a person you could overthrow. It was a system, an institution. Rulers could come and go, but the throne, the system of control, remained. People were born into this structure, accepting it as the natural order of things, not as a choice. It was like the air they breathed always. They're unquestioned. But building a structure wasn't enough. Power needed to control the narrative, the story we tell ourselves about who we are. So, it became the ultimate storyteller. History books were written, not just to record events, but to justify the authority of those in charge. Past rulers were painted as heroes, their decisions as wise and necessary. Acts of control, even brutal ones, were reframed as essential for maintaining order and safety. And what about those who resisted? Their stories were often twisted, their motives questioned, or worse, they were simply erased from the pages of history altogether. By controlling memory, power controlled meaning. It shaped our understanding of the past to secure its own future. Then came the slow, creeping strategy of normalization. This is perhaps one of power's most subtle and effective tricks. Harsh rules and greater control weren't introduced overnight in a sudden shock. That would cause an uproar. Instead, they were rolled out gradually, bit by bit, over generations. Each new generation accepted a little more control, a slightly tighter grip than the one before it. Because the change was so slow, it barely registered. It felt tolerable, normal even. People adapted, often without realizing just how much freedom they had traded away for a sense of stability. It's like the old story of the frog in boiling water. If you turn up the heat slowly enough, it doesn't notice it's in danger until it's too late. This brings us to another key tactic: confusing stability with justice. Power taught us that a functioning society is a just society. As long as the trains run on time and the streets are safe, the deep inequalities and injustices simmering beneath the surface can be ignored. Order became the ultimate virtue, valued even more than fairness. We were taught to believe that questioning authority, challenging the status quo, would inevitably lead to chaos and collapse. The message was clear: your personal suffering is a small price to pay for collective stability, even when the system itself is the source of that suffering. And perhaps the most powerful tool of all was creating dependency. Power cleverly tied our very survival to obedience. Think about it. Access to a job, a home, food, safety for your family, all of these things became conditional on playing by the rules. Compliance wasn't just a moral choice, it became a practical necessity. To step out of line, to disobey, meant risking everything. It meant losing your livelihood, your social standing, and your security. This made the act of resistance an incredibly high-stakes gambling. It wasn't just about disagreeing with a policy. It was about putting your entire life on the line. But here's the beautiful, hopeful paradox in all of this. The very fact that power has to work so hard to protect itself reveals its greatest weakness. All these elaborate defenses, the punishments, the propaganda, the systems of control, all expose an underlying fragility. If authority were truly natural and rightful, it wouldn't need to be constantly reinforced. It wouldn't need to rewrite history, normalize injustice, or threaten us with chaos. The constant effort proves that power is not a law of nature, it's a human construction. And that's the crucial takeaway. Power only appears permanent as long as we collectively believe it is. Its fortress is built on the foundation of our obedience and our belief in its legitimacy. History is filled with examples of seemingly unbreakable systems of control that eventually crumbled, not because the power magically vanished, but because ordinary people, one by one, and then all at once, stopped believing in its story. They saw the cracks in the walls and realized the fortress wasn't as strong as it looked. The moment we question the narrative, the moment we withdraw our consent, the entire structure begins to tremble. And that is a thought that holds incredible power of its own. The fifth topic is the legacy of the first taste. Have you ever wondered why the world is the way it is? why some people have so much power and others have so little. It all goes back to a single moment in human history, a moment we can call the first taste of power. Imagine, for the first time, a group of early humans realized they could control something, not just hunt an animal, but control a piece of land, a water source, or even other people. That first taste was intoxicating. It was a revelation. Suddenly, the world wasn't just a place you survived in, it was a place you could shape. This wasn't a fleeting victory. The idea of control didn't die with the people who first discovered it. Instead, it became a seed that grew into the vast and complex structures we see today. It outlived them, passed down from one generation to the next. What began as a temporary tool for survival became a permanent blueprint for society. Power wasn't just about strength anymore. It became an institution, a system of rules and hierarchies that felt solid, unchangeable, and completely normal. Think about it. Think about it. We are all born into a world that was designed long before we arrived. We inherit its laws, its traditions, its social ladders, and its beliefs. Most of us never witnessed the moment these systems were created. We only see the finished product. And because this system has existed for our entire lives, and for our parents' lives, it feels natural, almost like a law of physics. We accept that some people lead and others follow, that some have wealth and others struggle. We accept it because we can't imagine a world without it. It's just the way things are. But what makes power so incredibly enduring isn't just brute force or physical strength. It's memory. It's the stories we tell, the history we learn, and the roles we're taught to play. Power survives because it embeds itself in our culture and our minds. It becomes part of our collective memory, passed down not through genes, but through education, tradition, and social norms. Every time we follow a rule without asking why, or accept a hierarchy without questioning its fairness, we are reinforcing a structure that was built on that very first taste of control, thousands of years ago. However, this legacy of power is a double-edged sword. It's a story with two sides. While power creates systems of domination, it also paradoxically creates the seeds of its own destruction. Every structure that demands obedience eventually creates awareness. The very act of enforcing control highlights the inequality it depends on. When you build a wall, you're not just keeping people out, you're also showing everyone where the line is drawn. The same systems that try to enforce silence also, unintentionally, reveal who benefits and who sacrifices. And that's where things get interesting. Over time, people start to notice. They begin to see the patterns. They ask simple but dangerous questions. Who gets to make the rules? Who has to obey them? Why do some people have so much while others have so little? This growing awareness is the single greatest threat to established power. It's like a crack in a dam. It might start small, with just one person asking a question, but it can grow until the entire structure collapses. Power thrives in the dark, when it is unseen and unquestioned. Awareness is the light that exposes it. So, that first taste of power taught humanity two fundamental lessons. The first was that control could be used to build entire civilizations, to shape societies, and to direct the course of history. But the second, and arguably more important lesson, was that control can always be challenged. History is not a straight line of ever-increasing domination. It's a cycle. It's a constant push and pull between authority rising and that same authority being questioned. Empires are built on obedience, but they crumble because of disbelief. Dictatorships are maintained by fear, but they are toppled by courage. Even today, in our modern, sophisticated world, power uses the same ancient tools. It might look different on the surface, but the underlying logic is identical. It uses fear to make us compliant. It uses tradition to convince us that the current way is the only way. It creates dependency, making us rely on the system for our survival and well-being. And it uses reward, giving just enough to the right people to keep them invested in maintaining the status quo. The forms have changed from kings and empires to corporations and political systems, but the game remains the same. Power's greatest trick is to make itself invisible. It wants to be accepted as the natural order of things, as normal as just common sense. It survives as long as we don't see it as a deliberate design, a set of choices made by people to benefit other people. Change, real, meaningful change, begins the very moment we recognize power for what it truly is. Not destiny, but a design. And if it was designed by people, it can be redesigned by people. The legacy of that first taste is still unfolding all around us. It's not a closed chapter in a history book. It's the story we are living in right now. Every time you ask why, every time you challenge an assumption, Every time you refuse to obey a rule that feels unjust, you are participating in this ancient struggle. Every act of questioning, no matter how small, weakens the illusion that power is permanent and unchangeable. It reminds us that the structures we live in are not made of stone, but of ideas. And ideas can change. Ultimately, power has shaped humanity in profound ways, but it has never fully owned us. It has built empires and toppled them, created vast wealth and desperate poverty, but it has never conquered the one thing that makes us human: our ability to think for ourselves. As long as we can reason, as long as we can imagine a different world, as long as we can feel empathy for others, power can be resisted. That is the lesson history keeps trying to teach us, over and over again. The story isn't over, and the next chapter is up to us. Thanks for watching. If this made you think, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the forces that shape our world. See you next time.